Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing cases recorded in the history of the Ozark Mountains. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time you're listening to this narration. We're interested to know to what places and at what times of day or night these documented stories reach. In the autumn of 1916, when the Ozark Mountains were draped in shades of amber and crimson, the small community of Blackwell Springs, Missouri, experienced a series of events that would forever alter the fabric of local history. The Blackwell Sisters, Martha and Elizabeth, emerged as central figures in what would later be documented as one of the most unsettling medical anomalies of the early 20th century. The sisters resided in a weathered Victorian farmhouse at the end of Pine Hollow Road, approximately 3 miles east of the town square. The property had been in the Blackwell family since 1873, when their grandfather, a former Union soldier, established roots in the region following the Civil War. Martha, the elder sister at 28, and Elizabeth, 24, lived alone after the passing of their parents in a typhoid epidemic that swept through the region in 1912. Local records from the Blackwell Springs Gazette describe the sisters as reserved but cordial, often seen at church gatherings and occasional town meetings, but generally maintaining a private existence. What distinguished the Blackwell sisters, however, was not their reclusive nature, but rather what local physician Dr. Samuel Harrison documented as an unprecedented physiological phenomenon in his medical journal dated October 12, 1916. According to Dr. Harrison's meticulous notes, preserved in the Missouri Historical Society archives until their mysterious disappearance in 1964, the Blackwell sisters possessed an unusual ability to diagnose illness in others through physical proximity. The first documented instance occurred when Martha Blackwell reportedly informed Mrs. Abigail Winters, the baker's wife, that she carried something dark in her abdomen after briefly touching her hand during a church social. 3 weeks later, Mrs. Winters was diagnosed with advanced ovarian cancer by a specialist in Springfield. Such occurrences might have been dismissed as coincidence had they not continued with alarming frequency. Elizabeth Blackwell allegedly informed Thomas Miller, the local blacksmith, that his heart beat with irregularity after standing near him at the general store. Miller, a robust man with no prior health concerns, suffered a minor heart attack the following month. Dr. Harrison's journal entries grew increasingly detailed as he began documenting these cases with scientific interest rather than superstitious alarm. The Blackwell women appeared to possess an extraordinary sensitivity to physiological abnormalities in others, wrote Harrison in an entry dated November 3, 1916. Their accuracy defies conventional medical understanding. I have begun to consider that they may possess heightened sensory perception, perhaps detecting subtle changes in body temperature, perspiration patterns, or even olfactory indicators of disease that remain imperceptible to others. The community's initial fascination with the sisters' apparent gift gradually transformed into something more complex. Entries in the town council minutes from late 1916 indicate growing discomfort among certain residents. The matter of the Blackwell property and its occupants appears repeatedly in meeting agendas, though specific discussions were not transcribed in detail. What is evident from subsequent newspaper clippings is that by December 1916, the sisters began to withdraw further from community life. Before their isolation became complete, several documented interactions between the Blackwell sisters and community members paint a picture of the peculiar nature of their abilities. Carolyn Dunham, wife of the local postmaster, reported to Dr. Harrison that upon delivering a package to the Blackwell home in early November, Martha had taken her hand and gone suddenly pale. She looked at me with such concern, Mrs. Dunham later recounted in a letter to her sister in Kansas City, preserved in the family collection. She asked if I had been experiencing headaches and dizziness. I hadn't told a soul about those spells, not even my husband. 3 days later, I collapsed in the kitchen. The doctor in Springfield said I had dangerously high blood pressure that could have led to a stroke. The ledger from Pemberton's pharmacy in Blackwell Springs shows that from October through December 1916, the Blackwell Sisters purchased unusual quantities of medical reference books through special order. Titles included Gray's Anatomy, recent medical journals from Johns Hopkins, and several volumes on neurology and sensory perception. The shop owner, Frederick Pemberton, noted in his personal diary that Elizabeth had specifically requested any available texts on the relationship between touch sensitivity and internal awareness, a phrase he found curious enough to record. The weathered farmhouse on Pine Hollow Road became increasingly isolated as winter descended upon the Ozarks. The sisters were rarely seen in town, and according to postal records, they ceased collecting their mail after December 18th. Local delivery boy James Morley, then 15 years old, provided testimony to the Blackwell County Historical Society in 1958, describing his last visit to the Blackwell property. The house felt different that day, Morley recalled, colder somehow, even though smoke rose from the chimney. Miss Martha answered the door, but only halfway. She wouldn't take the parcel directly from my hands, had me set it down on the porch step. Before she closed the door, I noticed her fingers. They were wrapped in cloth, all of them, like she'd burned herself badly. She wouldn't look at me directly, either. Morley's account was corroborated by another witness, Edith Claymore, who served as housekeeper for several prominent families in Blackwell Springs. In a recorded interview conducted by the Ozark Folklore Society in 1962, Mrs. Claymore described encountering Elizabeth Blackwell on the forest path connecting Pine Hollow Road to the main thoroughfare in mid-December. Miss Elizabeth was standing still as a statue, just staring at her hands, Claymore stated. It was cold enough to see her breath, but she wore no gloves. When she noticed me, she hid her hands in her coat pockets real quick. I asked if everything was all right up at the house, and she said something that stuck with me all these years. She said, "We're beginning to see beneath the skin, Mrs. Claymore. It's remarkable and terrible all at once." Then she hurried past me without another word. I remember thinking her eyes looked different somehow, like she was looking at something far away, even though she was staring right at me. What transpired between December 1916 and February 1917 remains largely undocumented. The harsh winter isolated many homesteads in the Ozarks, and communication between outlying properties and the town center was limited. One notable exception comes from the journal of Reverend Thomas Grayson, who recorded attempting to visit the Blackwell home in early January after church members expressed concern about the sisters' absence from Christmas services. The journey to Pine Hollow was treacherous due to recent snowfall, Grayson wrote. Upon arriving, I found the house appeared occupied, smoke from the chimney, lamps visible within. Yet no response came to my repeated knocking. As I was preparing to depart, I distinctly heard a woman's voice from within, though I could not discern the words. The tone suggested distress, or perhaps intense concentration. I left a basket of provisions on the porch and marked in the snow that I'd been there. Upon returning a week later, I found my markings covered by fresh snow, but the basket remained untouched in exactly the same position. The next significant entry regarding the Blackwell sisters appears in Dr. Harrison's journal on February 23, 1917, following a house call he made at the request of Elizabeth Blackwell, who had sent a brief note via a passing timber worker. Harrison's entry from that date runs for several pages, but the most pertinent observation reads, "I found Martha in a state of significant distress. She refuses physical examination and remains confined to the second floor of the residence." Elizabeth appears gaunt, significantly underweight, and exhibits signs of extended sleep deprivation. Most concerning are the extensive bandages covering both women's hands. Elizabeth refused to allow me to examine these wounds, stating only that the touch has turned inward. I left medication for pain and sleep, though I fear something more troubling than physical ailment affects the household. A subsequent entry, dated February 26th, reveals that Harrison returned uninvited to the Blackwell home, concerned about what he had witnessed. I arrived unannounced to find Elizabeth in the parlor surrounded by anatomical drawings unlike any I have seen in medical texts. When questioned, she explained they represented internal landscapes, as she called them, detailed renderings of human organs, tissue, and cellular structures, but with unusual annotations in a symbolic language I could not decipher. Most disturbing was her claim that these drawings were created not from medical references, but from direct perception that she and Martha had developed the ability to see inside themselves through touch. She demonstrated by placing her bandaged hand against her abdomen and describing with unsettling precision the current state of her digestive processes. Medical knowledge alone cannot explain such detailed awareness of one's internal functions. Harrison's notes indicate he attempted to persuade Elizabeth to accompany him to Springfield for examination by specialists, an offer she firmly declined. Before departing, he requested to see Martha, but was again refused. He recorded hearing rhythmic tapping from the upper floor of the house, though Elizabeth offered no explanation for the sound. The local newspaper mentioned nothing of the sisters until March 15, 1917, when a small article appeared noting that Elizabeth Blackwell had been seen at Caldwell's General Store, purchasing unusual quantities of medical supplies, including gauze, alcohol, and laudanum. The storekeeper, Harold Caldwell, reported that Elizabeth's appearance had dramatically altered. She had lost considerable weight, and her once auburn hair showed streaks of gray despite her young age. A previously unpublished account from Sarah Caldwell, the storekeeper's wife, was discovered in 1965 in a collection of personal papers donated to the Blackwell County Library. In it, she described Elizabeth's visit in greater detail. Her hands remained covered in those strange bandages, but what struck me most was how she moved, cautious, deliberate, as if every motion required careful consideration. When Harold asked about Martha, Elizabeth said her sister had made a breakthrough in their work. She can feel her own heartbeat, Elizabeth said, not just the pulse, but the actual chambers contracting, the valves opening and closing. Harold thought she was speaking poetically, but the look in her eyes suggested otherwise. Before leaving, she requested several small mirrors and fine sewing needles, items we wouldn't typically stock together. By early April 1917, rumors began circulating through Blackwell Springs. Children walking home from the schoolhouse reported hearing strange sounds emanating from the Blackwell property, like someone crying but not quite, according to 10-year-old Sarah Palmer's account, preserved in her family Bible margin notes discovered decades later. Adults in the community noticed that the typically well-maintained property had fallen into a state of neglect. The spring garden, which Elizabeth had always tended with care, remained unplanted, and the white fence surrounding the house had begun to deteriorate. Joseph Cranmer, who operated the livery stable in Blackwell Springs, reported encountering Elizabeth Blackwell on April 12, 1917, as she was purchasing supplies at the feed store. His account, documented in a statement to Sheriff William Tanner following subsequent events, described Elizabeth as severely altered in countenance and behavior. Miss Blackwell appeared to have difficulty maintaining her balance, Cranmer stated. When I offered assistance with her parcels, she recoiled as if my proximity caused her discomfort. I noticed her bandages extended beyond her hands to her forearms. Most unsettling was her response when I inquired after her health. She stated, "Mr. Cranmer, we have begun to understand that the body is not what we believed it to be. The boundaries are more permeable than science has recognized." When I asked after Miss Martha, she replied only that her sister had progressed further and now spent most days in a state of internal observation. Before departing, she requested that I deliver a message to Dr. Harrison, stating that they had moved beyond diagnosis to intervention. On April 29, 1917, Dr. Harrison made another visit to the Blackwell residence, this time uninvited. His journal entry from that date contains perhaps the most disturbing observations yet. I was admitted reluctantly by Elizabeth, who appears to have aged years in mere months. The interior of the home bears little resemblance to the orderly household I recalled. Papers, what appear to be medical journals, and anatomical drawings cover every surface. Elizabeth's arms are now fully bandaged to the elbows. She spoke in disjointed sentences about their condition having evolved. She referred repeatedly to Martha's breakthrough, but denied my request to see her sister. Most alarming was Elizabeth's insistence that they had begun to feel themselves from the inside. When questioned further, she became agitated and requested my departure. Harrison's journal continues. As I prepared to leave, a sudden crash from upstairs prompted Elizabeth to rush toward the staircase. In that moment of distraction, I glimpsed what appeared to be an entrance to the root cellar, its door ajar. Within, I observed what can only be described as an improvised laboratory, tables covered with medical instruments, journals, and what appeared to be biological specimens in glass containers. Before I could investigate further, Elizabeth returned and firmly escorted me from the premises. Her parting words have remained with me. Doctor, we have discovered something profound about human perception. The body knows itself in ways science has yet to comprehend. Martha has already crossed a threshold I am only beginning to approach. Following this visit, Dr. Harrison apparently contacted colleagues at Washington University Medical School in St. Louis. A letter dated May 7, 1917, from Dr. William Chambers, professor of neurology to Harrison, survives in the university archives. It reads, in part, "Your description of the Blackwell case is most intriguing. The phenomenon you describe bears some resemblance to cases of heightened proprioception documented in medical literature, though never to such an extreme degree. I would be most interested in examining these women personally, should they be amenable to scientific observation." This correspondence suggests that the medical community had taken interest in the Blackwell case. However, no record exists of any follow-up visit from Dr. Chambers or other medical professionals. Instead, local records indicate an increasing concern among townspeople about the welfare of the sisters. An entry in the Blackwell Springs Sheriff's Log, dated May 13, 1917, notes a complaint from neighboring farmer William Decker, who reported unusual odors emanating from the Blackwell property and lights moving in the house at all hours. Sheriff Tanner's response is recorded simply as investigated, no evidence of unlawful activity. Residents declined assistance. A more detailed account appears in a letter Sheriff Tanner wrote to his brother in Jefferson City, discovered among family papers in 1972. This Blackwell business has the town on edge. I visited the property after Decker's complaint and found the house in disarray but no clear cause for intervention. Elizabeth met me at the door, appearing severely malnourished. When asked about the unusual activities reported by neighbors, she explained they were conducting personal research into sensory development. She declined to elaborate further or to allow me entry. I caught a glimpse of Martha through an upstairs window, motionless, staring at her own reflection in a large mirror. Something about this case unsettles me deeply, but without evidence of criminal activity, my hands are tied. Reverend Thomas Grayson noted in his personal diary, discovered during church renovations in 1955, that he had attempted to visit the Blackwell home on 3 separate occasions in May 1917, finding no response despite evidence of occupancy. His final entry regarding the sisters, dated June 2, 1917, reads, "I have prayed at length regarding the Blackwell situation. This afternoon I left a Bible on their porch, open to Ecclesiastes 1:18. For with much wisdom comes much sorrow. The more knowledge, the more grief. Upon returning to my wagon, I observed Elizabeth watching from an upstairs window. She made no acknowledgment of my presence, but I perceived in her gaze not hostility, but profound weariness, as one who has seen too much." The most illuminating pre-fire account comes from Millicent Porter, a midwife who encountered Elizabeth Blackwell at Pemberton's Pharmacy on June 8, 1917. In a statement given to Dr. Eleanor Shipley during her 1932 investigation, Porter recalled, "Miss Elizabeth appeared at the counter just as I was collecting a remedy for Mrs. Taylor's infant. Her condition was shocking. Emaciated, hair almost entirely gray, movements jerky like someone in pain. Most disturbing were her eyes. They seemed to focus on things not present, shifting rapidly as if tracking invisible movements. When Mr. Pemberton asked after her health, she replied, 'We have nearly completed our work. Martha can now control her own heart rate and blood flow to specific regions. I remain several steps behind, but progressing.' She then turned to me and said, 'Mrs. Porter, you should examine Mrs. Taylor's infant more carefully. There is a shadow in the left lung.' I had detected no such issue, but upon my next visit, I found the child developing pneumonia in precisely that location. The turning point in the Blackwell Sisters' story came on June 12, 1917. According to sheriff's reports filed in the county courthouse, a fire was reported at the Blackwell property shortly after midnight. By the time neighbors and the volunteer fire brigade arrived, the house was fully engulfed in flames. The report states that despite efforts to search the property, no remains were immediately discovered, leading to initial speculation that the sisters had abandoned the house prior to the fire. 3 days later, however, as workers sifted through the debris, they discovered what Sheriff William Tanner described as an unusual configuration in the root cellar. Though partially destroyed by fire, the cellar contained evidence that it had been converted into what appeared to be a rudimentary medical facility. Shelves lined with bottles, medical instruments of unknown purpose, and extensive handwritten journals, most too damaged by water and fire to decipher, suggested the sisters had established some sort of research space beneath their home. It wasn't until workers reached the far corner of the cellar that they made the most disturbing discovery. 2 figures, presumed to be Martha and Elizabeth Blackwell, were found seated facing one another. According to the sheriff's report, both bodies were extensively wrapped in medical gauze, particularly the hands, arms, and facial areas. The report notes that despite the fire having penetrated the cellar in multiple locations, the bodies themselves showed minimal fire damage, suggesting they had expired prior to the outbreak of flames. James Fletcher, one of the volunteer firefighters who assisted in recovering the bodies, provided additional details in an oral history recorded by the Ozarks Historical Society in 1951. What struck me most wasn't the bandages, although there were plenty of those, but the position. They sat facing each other, back straight, hands extended toward one another, but not quite touching, almost like they were frozen in the middle of some kind of ritual. Neither body showed signs of struggling or attempting to escape the fire. The expressions visible beneath the partial face bandages appeared peaceful isn't the right word, intent maybe, like people deeply focused on something invisible to everyone else. Dr. Harrison was called to examine the scene and, according to his final journal entry regarding the Blackwell case, made several observations that were subsequently omitted from official records. The entry, dated June 16, 1917, reads in part, "What I witnessed in the Blackwell cellar defies medical explanation. The sisters' bodies were positioned in a deliberate manner, hands extended toward one another but not quite touching. The extensive bandaging, when carefully removed, revealed no external wounds or burns as previously assumed. Instead, the skin beneath appeared unnaturally transparent, with vascular structures clearly visible, as if the epidermis had somehow atrophied while preserving integrity. Most inexplicable were the numerous notebooks recovered intact from a metal box. The writings therein document what appears to be the sisters' systematic attempt to turn their diagnostic sensitivity inward, to map their own interiors, as Elizabeth phrases it. The final entries suggest they believed they had achieved some form of complete internal awareness, able to sense and possibly influence their own physiological processes down to the cellular level. In a previously unpublished addendum to this entry, Discovered among Harrison's personal effects following his death in 1943, he wrote, "The autopsy findings are most disturbing. Both sisters exhibited unprecedented neural development in the somatosensory cortex, the region responsible for processing touch and proprioception. More alarming were the self-inflicted modifications evident throughout their bodies. Using what appears to have been a combination of acupuncture techniques and procedures of their own devising, they had systematically altered nerve pathways through precisely placed punctures and what can only be described as redirections of neural connections. The technical skill required for such modification suggests a level of anatomical awareness that modern medical science would consider impossible without visual aids and surgical training. How they achieved this through self-experimentation remains incomprehensible. I have omitted these findings from official records, as they would surely be dismissed as impossible by the medical community and would only further distress the local population. The official cause of death for the Blackwell sisters was recorded as asphyxiation due to smoke inhalation, though Dr. Harrison's private notes suggest he harbored significant doubts about this conclusion. The bodies were interred in the Blackwell Springs Cemetery on June 18, 1917, in a sparsely attended service. Within weeks of the funeral, Dr. Harrison accepted a position at a hospital in Chicago, leaving Blackwell Springs abruptly after 15 years of practice in the community. Local newspaper archives reveal that before his departure, Harrison conducted a final visit to the Blackwell property. The Blackwell Springs Gazette reported on June 25, 1917, Dr. S. Harrison, accompanied by Sheriff Tanner, revisited the site of the recent tragic fire at the Blackwell residence. Sources indicate they removed several items from the root cellar for further examination. When questioned about the nature of these items, both men declined to comment. Dr. Harrison has tendered his resignation from medical practice in our community, citing a position offered in Chicago. He departs at month's end. A letter from Sheriff Tanner to Dr. Harrison, dated August 3, 1917, and preserved in the Missouri State Archives, alludes to the materials recovered. I have, as promised, destroyed the remaining notebooks and specimens as we agreed was best. The final journal you asked to review should now be in your possession via courier. I must emphasize the importance of discretion regarding its contents. The community has begun to recover from the tragedy, and speculation about the sisters' activities has largely subsided. I believe this is for the best. Some knowledge, as you yourself stated, may be too disruptive to share widely. The Blackwell case might have remained a mere local tragedy had it not been for the interest of Dr. Eleanor Shipley, a researcher in abnormal psychology at Johns Hopkins University. In 1932, while researching unusual cases of sensory perception, Dr. Shipley encountered references to Dr. Harrison's observations of the Blackwell sisters. Her subsequent investigation led her to Blackwell Springs, where she conducted interviews with remaining residents who had known the sisters. Among those interviewed was Margaret Wilson, who had served as a housekeeper for the Blackwell family prior to the parents' deaths in 1912. Wilson's testimony, recorded in Shipley's research notes, provides insight into the sisters' early development. Even as young girls, Martha and Elizabeth showed unusual sensitivity. Their mother once remarked that Martha could identify when milk had begun to sour before any visible or olfactory signs were apparent. Elizabeth demonstrated an uncanny ability to locate lost objects by touch, running her fingers over surfaces until she could determine what lay beneath or behind them. Their father, a practical man, discouraged what he termed excessive sensitivity, but their mother, who had trained briefly as a nurse before marriage, encouraged their natural abilities. Following their parents' deaths, the sisters began systematically developing what they had previously experienced as incidental talents. Dr. Shipley's unpublished manuscript, Extraordinary Perception, the Blackwell Case Study, completed in 1934, attempted to provide a scientific framework for understanding the sisters' apparent abilities. In it, she proposed that Martha and Elizabeth may have possessed an extreme form of synesthesia, a neurological condition in which stimulation of one sensory pathway leads to automatic involuntary experiences in a second sensory pathway. Shipley theorized that the Blackwell sisters could have experienced a unique form of this condition, allowing them to sense physiological abnormalities in others through subtle cues that most individuals would never consciously process. More controversial was Shipley's examination of the fragmentary journal entries recovered from the Blackwell cellar. In her manuscript, she wrote, "The sisters' writings suggest they believed their unusual perception could be directed inward through concentrated effort. The journals describe exercises they developed to enhance what they termed interior vision, techniques bearing striking resemblance to certain meditative practices, though developed apparently in isolation." The sisters' documentation becomes increasingly technical, yet paradoxically mystical, describing sensations and awareness that, if taken literally, would indicate perception at a cellular or even molecular level, a physiological impossibility according to our current understanding. Shipley's notes include transcriptions of several partially preserved journal fragments attributed to Elizabeth Blackwell, and dated approximately May 1917, Martha has progressed beyond mere awareness to control. What begins as scientific self-experimentation progressively takes on characteristics of obsession, particularly in the final months. Today, she demonstrated an ability to selectively restrict blood flow to her left hand through concentration alone, no physical constriction applied. The hand blanched visibly within 30 seconds of her beginning the mental exercise and returned to normal coloration upon release of concentration. She reports experiencing each blood vessel as a distinct pathway that can be individually addressed through focused attention. My own progress remains less advanced, though I have begun to perceive the electrical impulses of my nervous system as discrete events rather than a continuous flow. The sensation defies description in conventional terms, perhaps closest to perceiving individual raindrops within a storm, rather than merely the general phenomenon of rainfall. Another fragment, undated but appearing to be from the later period of experimentation, reads, "We have confirmed that our unusual sensitivity functions as a form of direct perception rather than merely heightened interpretation of the normal sensory input. The blindfolded tests proved this conclusively. Martha correctly identified the contents of all 12 sealed containers by touch alone, including distinguishing between nearly identical organic compounds. More significant is our growing certainty that this perception functions through a mechanism outside current scientific understanding, perhaps a form of direct cellular communication that bypasses conventional neural pathways. This would explain why our abilities increased exponentially following the systematic desensitization of our external tactile receptors. By reducing the noise of ordinary sensation, we have enhanced our access to deeper perceptive capacities." Dr. Shipley's work remained unpublished following her unexpected death in a laboratory accident in 1936. Her research materials, including transcriptions of the surviving Blackwell journals, were archived at Johns Hopkins University until 1964, when they were reported missing during a routine inventory. This disappearance coincided with the similar vanishing of Dr. Harrison's medical journals from the Missouri Historical Society, raising questions that remain unanswered. A former colleague of Shipley's, Dr. Richard Tanner, no relation to Sheriff Tanner, provided additional context in a 1965 interview with Science and Inquiry magazine. Eleanor became increasingly secretive about her Blackwell research in the months preceding her death. She confided to me that she had begun attempting to replicate some of the sisters' reported techniques for enhancing internal perception. She described achieving what she called preliminary results that both excited and disturbed her. Her final communication to me, a hastily written note delivered the day before her fatal laboratory accident, stated only, The boundaries are indeed more permeable than we have believed. The question now is whether knowing this represents advancement or grave error. The official report listed her death as resulting from accidental exposure to chemical reagents, but those who knew her questioned how someone of her experience and caution could make such a fundamental error in laboratory procedure. In 1952, the Blackwell property, which had remained abandoned since the fire, was purchased by the Ozark Land Development Corporation. During excavation for a planned housing development, workers discovered a sealed metal container approximately 20 feet from where the original house had stood. Inside were several glass slides containing what appeared to be human tissue samples, along with a handwritten note attributed to Elizabeth Blackwell. The note, verified by handwriting comparison with surviving documents, contained only one sentence: "We have seen what lies beneath, and now it sees through us." Construction was halted temporarily while University of Missouri researchers examined the slides. Their findings, documented in a brief academic paper published in the Journal of Histopathology in 1953, noted only that the samples showed unusual cellular architecture inconsistent with known human tissue typology. The paper was subsequently retracted without explanation, and requests for access to the samples have been consistently denied. Dr. Lawrence Pitfield, one of the researchers involved in the initial examination, broke his silence in a private letter to a colleague at Harvard Medical School in 1957, recently discovered in archived correspondence. "What we observed in the Blackwell samples defies conventional histological understanding. The cellular structures exhibited organizational patterns that suggest deliberate modification rather than pathological mutation, as if the tissue had been somehow trained to form novel configurations." More disturbing were the neural samples, which showed evidence of dendritic growth patterns completely outside established models of neural development. These formations appeared to create alternative pathways for neural transmission, bypassing normal synaptic junctions through what can only be described as cellular bridges. How such modifications could occur without surgical intervention remains inexplicable. The decision to retract our paper came from administrative levels far above our department, with the clear implication that further discussion of the findings would not be tolerated. The development project was eventually abandoned, and the land remains undeveloped to this day. Local residents report that vegetation grows unusually densely at the former site of the Blackwell home, creating an area that appears distinctly darker and more impenetrable than surrounding woodland when viewed from nearby hillsides. In 1959, an anonymous donor provided funds to the University of Chicago for the establishment of the Blackwell Initiative for Advanced Proprioceptive Research. The program operated for only 3 years before being quietly discontinued. During its brief existence, it published several papers on enhanced sensory perception in human subjects, focusing particularly on techniques for developing awareness of internal physiological processes, normally considered autonomic. The final paper, Boundaries of Conscious Physiological Control, was withdrawn prior to publication. All records of the initiative's activities were subsequently sealed under university archive protocols that prevent access until 2059. Perhaps the most intriguing postscript to the Blackwell case came in 1968, when Dr. Victor Mansfield, a neurologist researching proprioception disorders, attempted to locate the Blackwell Sisters' graves for potential exhumation and modern medical examination. According to cemetery records, the sisters were buried in adjacent plots in Section C of Blackwell Springs Cemetery. However, when Dr. Mansfield arrived with the necessary permits, he discovered that while the plots were marked in cemetery maps, no physical headstones or grave markers existed at the indicated locations. Ground-penetrating radar subsequently revealed that the soil in these locations showed no evidence of burial disturbance at the depth typically associated with interment. This discovery prompted a brief investigation by local authorities, who concluded that record-keeping errors must have occurred following the 1917 funerals. Alternative explanations, including the possibility that the bodies were removed at some point for medical study, have never been substantiated. Dr. Mansfield's subsequent request to access any remaining physical evidence from the Blackwell case was denied by county officials, citing the absence of surviving materials. Mansfield's research notes, shared with colleagues at a 1970 neurology conference but never formally published, included a curious addendum. Following the disappointing results at Blackwell Springs Cemetery, I made inquiries at several medical institutions known to maintain historical anatomical collections. While I encountered no official record of the Blackwell remains, a curator at one prominent Midwestern University medical school, who requested anonymity, informed me that in the late 1920s, the institution received an unusual donation of specialized neurological specimens, accompanied by extensive documentation of experimental procedures. These materials allegedly arrived from a physician formerly practicing in Missouri. Access to these specimens was restricted shortly after cataloging, and they were eventually transferred to a federal research facility under circumstances the curator described as irregular and concerning. My subsequent inquiries to government medical research divisions have met with consistent denials of knowledge. The final documented reference to the Blackwell Sisters appears in the minutes of the Ozark Historical Preservation Society, dated September 8, 1968. The minutes record the majority opinion that, while historically significant, the Blackwell matter remains insufficiently understood and potentially disturbing to public sensibilities. The minority report, submitted by local librarian Margaret Whitley, argued that the sisters represented a case of scientific importance that deserves recognition, regardless of the discomfort it may cause in acknowledging the boundaries of medical understanding. In 1972, a graduate student researching unusual medical cases discovered a previously overlooked document in the National Archives, a classified 1928 report from the then-nascent National Institutes of Health, referring to specimens of exceptional neurological significance acquired from a private medical collection in Illinois. The document references self-modified neural structures and evidence of unprecedented voluntary cellular reorganization. Access to the full report was denied on grounds of national security, and subsequent Freedom of Information Act requests have been consistently rejected. A motion to install a memorial plaque commemorating the sisters and their unique medical condition was proposed but ultimately rejected by a vote of 7-3. A former NIH researcher, speaking on condition of anonymity in 1981, claimed knowledge of ongoing government interest in the Blackwell case. The sisters demonstrated capabilities that, if verified and replicable, would revolutionize our understanding of human physiology and consciousness. The implications extend far beyond medical science into domains with significant security implications. The ability to perceive and potentially influence internal biological processes at a cellular level represents a paradigm shift that certain agencies have pursued quietly for decades. The Blackwell materials, what remains of them, continue to inform classified research programs focused on expanding the boundaries of human perception and physiological control. Today, little physical evidence remains of Martha and Elizabeth Blackwell. The land where their house once stood has been reclaimed by the dense Ozark forest. Occasional hikers in the area report an unusual silence surrounding the old property boundaries, though this could be attributed to the natural acoustics of the densely wooded hollow. Local historians maintain minimal records of the case, and many current residents of Blackwell Springs, now significantly expanded from its 1917 population, express no familiarity with the sisters or their story when questioned. Those who venture near the former Blackwell property occasionally report unusual physiological experiences, sudden awareness of their heartbeat, momentary perception of blood flowing through vessels, or fleeting sensations of internal organs normally outside conscious awareness. These reports are generally dismissed as psychosomatic responses influenced by knowledge of the site's history, though no formal studies have been conducted to verify this explanation. In 1994, during expansion of a hiking trail near the former Blackwell property, workers uncovered a small metal box containing a single glass vial of preserved tissue and a handwritten note. The contents were quickly confiscated by county officials and allegedly transferred to federal authorities. No public statement regarding this discovery was ever issued. A maintenance worker involved in the excavation later claimed the note contained just 5 words. The perception goes both ways now. What remains are questions that neither science nor time has adequately answered. Were the Blackwell sisters simply victims of their own delusions, perhaps suffering from a shared psychological condition exacerbated by isolation? Did they indeed possess extraordinary perceptual abilities that modern medicine might now classify through the lens of heightened sensory integration or previously undocumented neurological architecture? Or was there something else, something that exists in the narrow margin between known science and unexplained phenomena? In 2002, a neurophysiologist at Washington University published a paper examining historical cases of unusual sensory perception, including a brief reference to the Blackwell sisters. The paper proposed that certain individuals might possess naturally occurring variations in neural architecture that enable enhanced interoceptive awareness, the ability to perceive internal bodily states. The author suggested that the Blackwells may have represented an extreme case of this variation, potentially amplified through deliberate practice and systematic desensitization to external stimuli. The paper speculated that modern neuroscience, with its advanced imaging techniques, might have provided explanations for abilities that appeared inexplicable in 1917. However, without surviving biological samples or detailed medical documentation, such theories remain speculative. A more unconventional interpretation emerged in 2006 when anthropologist Dr. Marjorie Clement published Boundaries of Perception, Folk Practices, and Medical Anomalies in Rural American Communities, 1880-1940. Clement proposed that the Blackwell sisters might have independently developed techniques similar to certain meditative practices documented in Eastern traditions, which focus on developing awareness of internal physiological processes. She noted parallels between the fragmented descriptions of the sisters' methods and certain documented yogic practices aimed at developing conscious control of autonomic functions. Clement's work suggested that the sisters' isolation and intensive focus might have facilitated breakthroughs in perceptual ability that, while extraordinary, represented extensions of natural human capabilities rather than supernatural phenomena. In 2011, during renovation of the Blackwell Springs Public Library, workers discovered a sealed envelope hidden within the binding of a 1919 medical reference book. The envelope contained several pages of what appeared to be Elizabeth Blackwell's journal, preserved by the library's former director, Margaret Whitley, who had advocated for the sisters' memorial decades earlier. The pages described experiments conducted in April 1917, just weeks before the fatal fire. We have confirmed that the capacity for interior awareness extends beyond our own physiological boundaries. Yesterday, when Martha and I practiced simultaneous interior focus while maintaining physical contact, I began to perceive her circulatory system as distinctly as my own, at first as a vague impression, then with increasing clarity until I could distinguish individual vessels and their condition. Martha reported a similar awareness of my respiratory function, accurately describing a small area of congestion in my lower right lung that I had previously identified through self-examination. This suggests our unusual perception operates through a mechanism independent of conventional sensory pathways, perhaps a form of direct cellular communication that science has yet to identify. Most concerning is the persistent sensation that this awareness, once established, cannot be entirely deactivated. Even when physically separated, faint impressions of each other's internal states remain accessible, as if a permanent channel has been established. We must consider whether such connections, once formed, can ever be truly severed. These pages were submitted to handwriting analysis, which confirmed their likely authenticity. They now reside in the Missouri State Historical Society archives, though researchers report difficulty obtaining permission to examine them directly. The most recent development in the Blackwell case occurred in 2015, when Dr. Emily Tanner Wilson, great-granddaughter of Sheriff William Tanner, discovered a sealed container while clearing out a family storage space. Inside was a previously unknown final report from Dr. Samuel Harrison, apparently sent to Sheriff Tanner shortly before Harrison's death in 1943, with instructions that it remain sealed for 25 years, instructions that were evidently overlooked or deliberately ignored. The document contained Harrison's final reflections on the Blackwell case. As I approach the end of my life, I find myself returning constantly to the Blackwell Sisters and what they represent for our understanding of human potential. In the decades since their deaths, I have encountered nothing in medical literature that adequately explains their abilities or the transformations they underwent. My examination of their remains revealed physical modifications that should have been impossible to achieve without external intervention, yet the evidence suggested self-directed alterations at a cellular level. The Sisters' journals documented a progression from unusual sensory sensitivity to something far more profound, a fundamental shift in the relationship between consciousness and physiological processes. What troubles me most, even now, is not what Martha and Elizabeth achieved, but rather what their achievements suggest about the nature of human consciousness and its boundaries. If perception and awareness can extend to the cellular level through deliberate practice, what does this indicate about the conventional boundaries we assume between conscious and autonomic processes, between self and other, between distinct organisms? The Sisters' final experiments, particularly those suggesting perceptual bridges between their separate physiological systems, point toward possibilities that modern science remains reluctant to consider. I have kept samples and certain journal fragments separate from those I submitted to official archives, as I feared their implications would lead to suppression or exploitation. These materials suggest that in their final weeks, the Blackwell Sisters were experiencing what can only be described as a dissolution of the conventional boundaries of individual consciousness, a state in which the distinction between Martha's awareness and Elizabeth's began to blur. Their last documented experiment, conducted 3 days before the fire, involved an attempt to simultaneously modify each other's physiological processes through concentrated awareness alone, with reportedly successful results. I cannot escape the conclusion that the fire at the Blackwell home was not accidental, but deliberate, a final act by women who recognized that they had crossed a threshold from which return might be impossible, and whose implications for our understanding of human consciousness were too profound to be safely shared in 1917, or perhaps even now. Dr. Tanner Wilson submitted this document to the Missouri Historical Society, where it remains under restricted access, available only to researchers with specific academic credentials and institutional affiliation. The physical samples referenced in Harrison's final report were not found among the discovered materials, their location, if they still exist, remaining unknown. Dr. Harrison's final journal entry, discovered among his personal effects following his death in 1943, but subsequently lost during a Chicago Museum archival transfer in 1961, perhaps best encapsulates the enduring mystery. I have practiced medicine for 30 years, dedicated to the principle that the human body operates according to consistent, discoverable laws. The Blackwell case has forced me to confront the possibility that our understanding remains fundamentally incomplete. What troubles me most is not what the Sisters could perceive, but rather what their abilities suggest about the nature of human consciousness itself, that perhaps awareness extends into dimensions we have yet to comprehend, and that such knowledge, once gained, may exact a terrible price. The Blackwell Sisters' graves, if indeed they exist, remain unmarked in Blackwell Springs Cemetery. The town library contains no photographs of the women, their medical records have vanished, and the land where they once lived continues to resist development. All that remains is a story that science could not explain and perhaps never will, a reminder that even in the rational world of the early 20th century, there existed cases that defied conventional understanding. Occasionally, medical researchers investigating unusual cases of sensory perception or autonomic control still reference the Blackwell Sisters as a historical curiosity, an unverified but intriguing example of potential human capabilities beyond established norms. Neurologists studying interoception, the sense of the internal state of the body, sometimes note the Blackwell case as an early, if poorly documented, example of extreme interoceptive awareness. However, without surviving biological evidence or comprehensive records, the sisters remain primarily a footnote in medical history, rather than a substantiated phenomenon. Some local residents of the Ozarks claim that, on particularly still nights, visitors near the former Blackwell property report unusual sensory experiences, momentary awareness of their own internal organs, fleeting perceptions of blood flowing through vessels, or sudden consciousness of normally automatic processes like digestion or glandular secretions. Skeptics attribute these reports to suggestion and the power of narrative, while others wonder if something of the Blackwell sisters' unusual awareness might somehow linger in the location where they conducted their experiments. In 2018, a neuroscience graduate student allegedly gained temporary access to tissue samples held in a government archive that some believe originated from the Blackwell sisters. Before being denied further access, the student reported observing neural structures unlike any in current medical literature, structures suggesting deliberate reorganization rather than natural development or pathological mutation. This account, shared anonymously on academic forums, has never been officially verified or acknowledged by institutional authorities, and perhaps that is how it should remain. As Elizabeth Blackwell purportedly wrote in her final journal entry, recovered in fragments from the cellar, "To see completely is to lose the boundary between observer and observed. Martha and I now understand that some veils exist not to hide truth, but to protect us from it. The human mind evolved with certain perceptual limitations for good reason. To perceive too much, too directly, is to risk dissolution of the self. Yet once this path is begun, return becomes increasingly impossible. We stand at a threshold beyond which individual consciousness, as conventionally understood, may cease to exist. Whether what lies beyond represents transcendence or obliteration remains the final question we must answer for ourselves." The last official document referencing the Blackwell case is a restricted memo from a federal research division dated 1972, obtained through a partially successful Freedom of Information Act request in 2019. Though heavily redacted, the visible portion reads, "Historical Case B-17 continues to provide valuable insights regarding the outer boundaries of human perceptual capacity and conscious physiological control. Techniques derived from surviving documentation have yielded promising preliminary results in controlled settings, though ethical considerations preclude progression to the advanced stages described in the original subject's records. The fundamental question remains whether the reported final outcomes represent an actual breakthrough in human capability or the documentation of a shared psychotic event. Current research protocols are designed to approach these boundaries while maintaining necessary safety limitations that the original subjects evidently disregarded. Whether the Blackwell sisters discovered something profound about human perception and consciousness, or simply descended into shared delusion, remains unresolved. What persists is the possibility that conventional boundaries of awareness might be more permeable than science typically acknowledges, that within each human mind lies potential for perception, extending beyond the limits we commonly accept as fixed and immutable. For those who study the Blackwell case, one question remains paramount. If Martha and Elizabeth truly developed the abilities described in the fragmented records of their work, what was the nature of the threshold they ultimately crossed? And what might they have perceived on the other side? A deeper understanding of human consciousness, or something that exists beyond the boundaries of what we are meant to know? As visitors to Blackwell Springs occasionally report when standing near the site of the old house, there are moments when the boundary between self and surroundings seems to thin, when one's own heartbeat becomes not just a vague sensation, but a clearly perceived internal rhythm, when the distinction between observer and observed momentarily blurs. Such experiences typically last only seconds before normal perception reasserts itself, a fleeting glimpse, perhaps, of the domain the Blackwell sisters sought to fully enter, and from which they never returned.